The morning sun cast long shadows across the private terminal at JFK International Airport as a flight attendant rushed through her pre-flight checklist. She'd been working in private aviation for 5 years, and her crisp uniform and perfectly styled hair reflected her dedication to maintaining the highest standards of luxury service. However, beneath her polished exterior lay deeply rooted prejudices that were about to be challenged in the most unexpected way. As she meticulously arranged the champagne flutes in the jet's galley, she caught sight of a woman approaching the aircraft. The passenger wore simple jeans and a casual blazer, carrying just a small leather bag. The flight attendant's expression shifted, her lips tightening into a thin line. In her mind, this couldn't possibly be one of their elite clients. Without waiting for proper identification, she stepped onto the air stairs, blocking the entrance. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is a private aircraft. The commercial terminal is in the other direction." Her tone carried that special kind of condescension reserved for those deemed out of place in luxury spaces. The woman in jeans remained surprisingly calm, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I believe there must be some misunderstanding," she said softly, reaching into her blazer pocket. The flight attendant's posture stiffened, ready to call security if necessary. What happened next would become a defining moment in the flight attendant's career. The woman produced not just her ID, but documentation that made the flight attendant's face flush with embarrassment. This wasn't just any passenger, this was Dr. Richardson, a renowned neurosurgeon and, more importantly, the owner of the very jet the flight attendant was working on. Dr. Richardson had built her medical empire from scratch, starting in a small clinic in Detroit and expanding to a network of specialized neurological centers across the country. She'd purchased the private jet not for luxury, but to reach patients in critical condition across different states. Her simple appearance reflected her priorities, comfort and practicality over flashy displays of wealth. The flight attendant stammered through an apology, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. But Dr. Richardson didn't immediately react with anger or call for the attendant's dismissal, as many in her position might have. Instead, she paused at the top of the stairs and turned back. "You know," Dr. Richardson began, her voice carrying the weight of years of similar experiences, "I've learned that appearances can be misleading. I've been judged by my clothes, my skin color, and my gender throughout my career. Each time, I've chosen to turn those moments into opportunities for growth, not just for myself, but for others too." The flight attendant stood frozen, the magnitude of her mistake washing over her. She'd done exactly what she'd been trained not to do, make assumptions about passengers based on their appearance. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to protect the exclusive nature of private aviation, she'd disrespected the very person who owned the aircraft. As the morning light continued to stream through the cabin windows, Dr. Richardson settled into her seat, not in the main cabin where the flight attendant had assumed she'd be, but in her usual spot, a simple seat near the medical equipment storage area. She pulled out her laptop, already focusing on the patient files she needed to review before landing. The flight attendant moved through her service duties mechanical, her mind racing. Each interaction with Dr. Richardson now felt loaded with meaning. When she served coffee, her hands trembled slightly, but Dr. Richardson treated her with the same courtesy she extended to everyone, from the ground crew to the pilots. As they reached cruising altitude, the flight attendant found herself reflecting on her own journey in aviation. She'd fought against stereotypes herself, proving that a small-town girl could make it in the luxury aviation industry. Yet somehow, she'd become the very thing she'd once resented, someone who judged others based on preconceptions. The incident forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. How many other times had she made snap judgments about passengers? How many opportunities for connection and learning had she missed because of her biases? The weight of these questions sat heavy in her chest as the aircraft cruised at 40,000 feet. Throughout the flight, she observed Dr. Richardson handling several urgent medical consultations via secure video calls, coordinating with her team on the ground about a complex surgery scheduled for later that day. The contrast between her own superficial judgments and the depth of Dr. Richardson's contributions to society couldn't have been starker. As the first part of this journey drew to a close, the flight attendant realized this wasn't just about one embarrassing mistake, it was about the beginning of a profound change in perspective. The real journey, she understood, wouldn't end with this flight. It was just beginning. The next morning arrived with unexpected news. Dr. Richardson had requested the same flight attendant for her return journey that evening. The crew scheduling office was puzzled. It was rare for aircraft owners to make specific crew requests, especially after an uncomfortable incident. The flight attendant's stomach churned with anxiety when she received the notification. Throughout the day, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She'd spent the previous night tossing and turning, replaying the morning's events in her head. Her colleague at the crew lounge noticed her distraction. "You look like you've seen a ghost," they commented, sliding a cup of coffee across the break room table. The flight attendant managed a weak smile, finally voicing the thoughts that had been swirling in her mind. "I made a terrible mistake yesterday," she admitted, "the kind that should have gotten me fired. But instead of firing me, the client requested me again." Her colleague listened intently as she recounted the previous day's events. As evening approached, she arrived at the private terminal 2 hours early, meticulously preparing the cabin. This time, she stocked Dr. Richardson's preferred coffee brand and arranged the medical equipment storage area for easier access. Her hands moved with purpose, each action a small attempt at redemption. When Dr. Richardson arrived, she wasn't alone. A young girl accompanied her, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, wearing a bright yellow hijab and clutching a worn backpack. The flight attendant's curiosity must have shown on her face because Dr. Richardson paused to explain. "This is my patient, Noor," she said softly. "We're flying her to Boston Children's Hospital for a specialized procedure." Noor gave a shy wave, her other hand unconsciously touching the side of her head where a surgical scar was partially visible beneath her hijab. The flight attendant welcomed them aboard, her previous anxiety giving way to genuine concern for the young passenger. As she helped Noor settle into her seat, she noticed the girl's hands trembling slightly, whether from excitement or nervousness, she couldn't tell. During the flight, she observed the gentle interaction between Dr. Richardson and her young patient. The doctor wasn't just transporting Noor to another hospital, she was preparing her for what lay ahead, using simple drawings and kid-friendly analogies to explain the complex procedure. "You see," Dr. Richardson explained to Noor, sketching on a napkin, "your brain is like a beautiful garden. Right now, there's a little tangle in one of the pathways, like a knot in a garden hose. We're going to carefully unknot it so everything can flow smoothly again." Noor nodded, her eyes wide with understanding rather than fear. The flight attendant found herself drawn into their conversation. She brought Noor her requested ginger ale with extra ice, remembering how her own younger sister had always asked for the same thing during family trips. The parallel made her chest tighten with emotion. As she worked, Dr. Richardson's words from the previous day echoed in her mind, "I've learned that appearances can be misleading." Looking at Noor, she saw not just a patient, but a brave young soul facing challenges that would intimidate most adults. The girl's bright smile and curious questions about the aircraft revealed a spirit unbowed by her medical condition. Halfway through the flight, Noor experienced a moment of anxiety, her breathing becoming rapid. Without hesitation, the flight attendant retrieved a stress ball from her personal bag, something she carried for her own occasional flight anxiety. "Sometimes squeezing this helps," she offered gently. "And if you look out the window, you can see we're flying alongside the sunset. It's like we're racing the colors." Dr. Richardson watched this interaction with quiet approval. During a moment when Noor was absorbed in her tablet game, the doctor stepped into the galley where the flight attendant was preparing dinner service. "You know," Dr. Richardson began, her voice low and thoughtful, "yesterday's incident wasn't just about you or me. It was about something bigger, the assumptions we all carry and the choices we make when confronted with them. She paused, helping the flight attendant arrange the dinner trays. What matters isn't the mistake, but what we learn from it. The flight attendant felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. I've been thinking about it constantly, she admitted. About how many times I might have judged someone wrongly, how many stories I might have missed because I didn't look past the surface. Dr. Richardson nodded, understanding in her eyes. That awareness, that's the first step toward real change. We're all works in progress, learning and growing every day. She glanced back at Noor, who was now sleeping peacefully. Sometimes our greatest teachers come in unexpected packages. As they began their descent into Boston, the setting sun painted the cabin in warm hues. The flight attendant watched as Dr. Richardson gently woke Noor, helping her prepare for landing. In that moment, she realized that this flight was more than just a journey from one city to another. It was a testament to human resilience, compassion, and the power of second chances. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway, but the impact of this flight would continue to resonate long after the engines fell silent. As she helped gather Noor's belongings, the flight attendant understood that she wasn't just serving passengers anymore, she was participating in something far more meaningful, the intersection of lives, each with their own struggles, triumphs, and untold stories. The days following the Boston flight brought unexpected changes to the flight attendant's life. Word of her interaction with Dr. Richardson had spread through the private aviation community, but not in the way she had feared. Instead of becoming a cautionary tale about prejudice, her story was transforming into one of growth and redemption. During her next crew briefing, the chief of cabin services pulled her aside. Dr. Richardson has requested you as her dedicated flight attendant for all her medical transport flights, he announced, studying her reaction carefully. She believes you have a special touch with patients. Are you interested? The offer left her speechless. Just days ago, she'd been certain her career was over. Now, she was being offered a position that would align her work with something truly meaningful. Yes, she responded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, would be honored. Her first official flight in this new role came sooner than expected. Dr. Richardson needed to fly to Chicago to consult on a complex case. This time, when the doctor arrived at the aircraft, the flight attendant noticed everything she'd missed before, the subtle signs of exhaustion around her eyes, the well-worn medical tablet in her hand, the practical shoes chosen for long hours in operating rooms. During the flight, Dr. Richardson shared more about her work. Every patient has a story, she explained, reviewing medical files on her laptop. Sometimes, the biggest challenge isn't the medical procedure itself, it's understanding the human being behind the diagnosis. The flight attendant found herself drawn into these conversations, learning about the complexities of neurosurgery and the human spirit. Dr. Richardson spoke about patients who had shaped her career, about midnight emergencies and seemingly hopeless cases that turned into miraculous recoveries. One story particularly struck home. There was a young resident in my program, Dr. Richardson recalled, her eyes distant with memory. She was brilliant, top of her class. But some of the senior surgeons couldn't see past her appearance, her dreadlocks, her accent. They assumed she wouldn't fit in with their idea of what a neurosurgeon should look like. She paused, a small smile playing on her lips. Today, she's the head of pediatric neurosurgery at one of the country's top hospitals. The flight attendant thought about her own journey, about the assumptions she'd made and the ones made about her. How do you handle it? She asked quietly. The constant judgment, the need to prove yourself over and over? Dr. Richardson considered the question carefully. I decided early on that I wouldn't let other people's limitations become my own. Every dismissive comment, every doubtful look, I used them as fuel. But more importantly, I promised myself that when I achieved success, I would hold the door open for others. Their conversation was interrupted by turbulence. As the flight attendant secured the cabin, she noticed how Dr. Richardson remained focused on her work, unbothered by the bumpy air. Years of handling delicate brain tissue had given her steady hands and unshakable concentration. Later, during the meal service, Dr. Richardson received an urgent video call. A patient in Detroit had developed complications, and the local team needed her guidance. The flight attendant watched in amazement as the doctor transformed their small aircraft cabin into a virtual operating room, directing a complex medical procedure from 35,000 feet. Adjust the angle of approach by 2 degrees, Dr. Richardson instructed calmly, her eyes fixed on the surgical feed. Now check the temporal region. Her quiet confidence filled the cabin, and even though the flight attendant didn't understand the medical terminology, she could feel the weight of the moment. After the successful consultation, Dr. Richardson sat back, exhausted but relieved. The flight attendant brought her a fresh cup of coffee, prepared exactly as she had learned the doctor preferred it. "Thank you," Dr. Richardson said, then added with a knowing look, "You remind me of myself when I was younger." "How so?" the flight attendant asked, surprised by the comparison. "That determination to excel, the attention to detail, the way you've turned a challenging moment into an opportunity for growth." Dr. Richardson gestured to the perfectly organized cabin. "But more than that, I see someone who's beginning to understand that true service isn't about appearances, it's about seeing the humanity in everyone who crosses your path." As they began their descent into Chicago, the flight attendant reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few days. She'd gone from nearly losing her job to finding a new purpose in it. The private jet was no longer just a luxury transport vessel, it had become a vital link in a chain of medical care, and she was part of that mission. Through the cabin window, the lights of Chicago twinkled like earthbound stars. Dr. Richardson was reviewing one final case file, her dedication unwavering even as the wheels touched down. The flight attendant realized that she was witnessing something remarkable, not just medical excellence, but a deeper lesson about judgment, perseverance, and the power of giving people second chances. As they taxied to the private terminal, Dr. Richardson closed her laptop and turned to the flight attendant. "You know what the most important skill in medicine is?" she asked. "It's not steady hands or perfect technique. It's the ability to listen, to really hear what people are saying, and sometimes what they're not saying. I think you're developing that skill beautifully." Those words stayed with the flight attendant long after the engine spooled down and the cabin door opened to the Chicago night. She understood now that her role was about more than serving drinks or ensuring comfort, it was about being part of a larger purpose, about supporting those who saved lives and changed them for the better. A month into her new role as Dr. Richardson's dedicated flight attendant, a challenging situation tested everything she had learned. The call came at 3 a.m., an emergency flight was needed to transport a critical patient from a small regional hospital in rural Pennsylvania to a specialized facility in Baltimore. The flight attendant arrived at the airport while the city was still sleeping. The pre-dawn air held a bitter chill as she prepared the cabin with extra medical equipment. This wasn't going to be a typical flight, they were transporting a patient who had suffered a rare type of brain hemorrhage, and every minute counted. When Dr. Richardson arrived, she wasn't alone. A worried couple followed her, their faces etched with concern. They were the patient's parents, and the flight attendant could see they were struggling to maintain their composure. The mother's hands shook as she clutched a small overnight bag, while the father kept checking his phone, as if willing it to bring good news. "Their daughter is only 16, Dr. Richardson explained quietly in the galley. "She collapsed during basketball practice yesterday. The local hospital has done everything they can, but she needs specialized care." The gravity of the situation settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket. The flight attendant found herself drawing on every lesson she'd learned over the past month. She arranged the cabin to give the parents privacy while ensuring they remained close enough to hear updates about their daughter's condition. She provided them with warm blankets and herbal tea, remembering Dr. Richardson's words about how small comforts could make a difference in moments of crisis. During the flight, she observed how Dr. Richardson handled the situation with both professional efficiency and deep compassion. The doctor maintained constant communication with the medical teams on both ends while taking time to explain the treatment plan to the parents in terms they could understand. "Your daughter is a fighter," Dr. Richardson assured them, showing them brain scan images on her tablet. "See this area here? The fact that she's responding to treatment already is a very positive sign." The mother wiped away tears, clutching her husband's hand as they absorbed every word. The flight attendant found herself doing more than just serving, she became a quiet source of support. When the father mentioned they hadn't eaten since yesterday, she prepared light sandwiches. When the mother became overwhelmed with emotion, she appeared with tissues and a gentle smile. These weren't actions listed in any flight manual, but they felt right. Halfway through the flight, they hit unexpected turbulence. The flight attendant watched in amazement as Dr. Richardson continued her work undisturbed, her hands steady as she reviewed medical data and coordinated with the ground team. The doctor's calm demeanor helped settle the parents' nerves, showing them that even in rough air, their daughter's care remained the top priority. During a moment of quiet, the mother turned to the flight attendant. "I was so worried about this flight," she confessed. "Our daughter has never been this far from home, and now..." Her voice trailed off. The flight attendant sat beside her, offering silent support. Sometimes, she had learned, just being present was the most important service one could provide. Dr. Richardson, overhearing the conversation, joined them. "You know," she said, addressing both the parents and the flight attendant, "in my years of practice, I've learned that healing isn't just about medical procedures. It's about having a support system, about feeling cared for at every step of the journey." The father nodded, speaking for the first time in hours. "When we first heard we needed to fly our daughter to Baltimore, we were terrified. But being here, seeing how everyone works together." He gestured around the cabin, "It gives us hope." The flight attendant caught Dr. Richardson's approving glance. She understood now why the doctor had specifically requested her for these medical transport flights. It wasn't just about serving drinks or maintaining cabin safety, it was about being part of a healing environment, about understanding that every role, no matter how small it might seem, contributed to the larger mission of saving lives. As they began their descent into Baltimore, the early morning sun painted the sky in soft pinks and oranges. The flight attendant helped the parents gather their belongings, making sure they had everything they needed for their stay at the hospital. Dr. Richardson was already coordinating with the ground medical team, ensuring a seamless transfer for their patient. Just before landing, the mother pulled the flight attendant aside. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for the tea and blankets, but for making us feel less alone up here." The flight attendant felt tears prick at her eyes, remembering how just a month ago, she had been so focused on appearances and assumptions. Now she understood that true luxury wasn't about designer clothes or expensive champagne, it was about human connection and compassion. As they taxied to the private terminal, where an ambulance was already waiting, Dr. Richardson made one final call to the medical team. The flight attendant observed the seamless coordination, the way everyone knew their role in this carefully choreographed effort to save a young life. She realized that she had become part of something much bigger than herself, a network of caring professionals who work together to bring hope to families in their darkest hours. The parents gathered their courage as they prepared to disembark, ready to face the next phase of their daughter's treatment. Dr. Richardson walked with them, continuing to offer reassurance and explanation. The flight attendant watched them go, understanding that while her part in their journey was ending, she had contributed to something invaluable, not just professional service, but human kindness when it was needed most. The success of the emergency flight to Baltimore marked a turning point in the flight attendant's career. Word spread through the medical transport community about the exceptional care provided on Dr. Richardson's flights, and soon other medical professionals began requesting their team specifically for critical patient transfers. One particularly memorable morning, the flight attendant arrived at the hangar to find Dr. Richardson already there, looking more serious than usual. "Today's flight is different," she explained, her voice low. "We're transporting a renowned heart surgeon to perform an emergency transplant. The timing is crucial, we have exactly 4 hours to get him from New York to Houston." The pressure of the situation was palpable as they prepared the cabin. This wasn't just about comfort anymore, they were part of a precise medical timeline where every minute could mean the difference between life and death. The flight attendant found herself checking and rechecking everything twice, knowing that even the smallest delay could have serious consequences. When the surgeon arrived, he was accompanied by 2 surgical assistants. The flight attendant noticed immediately how different this medical team was from their usual passengers. They carried an intensity about them that filled the cabin with focused energy. There was no time for pleasantries, they immediately set up a mobile workstation, spreading out donor information and surgical plans across the tables. During the flight attendant observed the subtle dynamics between Dr. Richardson and the heart surgeon. Despite his reputation for being demanding and difficult, she noticed how Dr. Richardson's calm presence seemed to balance his intensity. They spoke in rapid medical terminology, discussing surgical approaches and contingency plans. The surgeon's hands never stopped moving. When he wasn't reviewing papers, he was performing finger exercises, keeping his surgical dexterity sharp. The flight attendant made sure to serve him water at precise intervals, remembering something Dr. Richardson had once mentioned about surgeon hydration being crucial for steady hands. Halfway through the flight, they encountered an unexpected challenge. Air traffic control announced a weather system that would require a slight deviation from their planned route. The surgeon's face darkened with concern. Even a 15-minute delay could impact the viability of the donor heart. This was when the flight attendant witnessed Dr. Richardson's leadership in action. Without missing a beat, she contacted her network of medical transport coordinators, who worked with air traffic control to secure priority routing. Meanwhile, the flight attendant adjusted the cabin temperature and lighting to help the medical team stay focused and comfortable during the delay. "I've never seen such coordination on a medical transport flight," one of the surgical assistants commented quietly to her while refilling his coffee. "Usually, these flights are just about getting from point A to point B. But this..." He gestured around the cabin, "This is different." The flight attendant smiled, remembering her own journey of understanding. "Dr. Richardson taught me that medical transport isn't just about the flight, it's about being part of the entire healing process." She watched as the doctor continued coordinating with ground teams, ensuring their slight delay wouldn't disrupt the complex choreography of the transplant procedure. As they approached Houston, the tension in the cabin reached its peak. The surgical team began their final preparation review, and the flight attendant could hear the surgeon muttering procedural steps under his breath. She maintained absolute silence in the cabin, understanding that these moments of mental preparation were crucial. Dr. Richardson moved to the galley where the flight attendant was preparing for landing. "You know," she said softly, "when I first requested you for these flights, some people questioned my decision. They thought I was taking an unnecessary risk after what happened that first day." She paused, watching the surgical team through the galley curtain. "But I saw something in you, the same thing I see in every great medical professional, the ability to learn from mistakes and turn them into opportunities for excellence." The flight attendant felt the weight of these words. Looking back, she could hardly recognize the person she'd been just a few months ago, so focused on superficial judgments. Now, she understood that true professional excellence wasn't about maintaining an image, it was about maintaining standards that could literally save lives. As they began their descent into Houston, the surgeon finally looked up from his preparations. To everyone's surprise, he addressed the whole cabin crew. "I've flown hundreds of medical transport flights," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to operating rooms. "But I've never felt more confident about making my timeline than I do today. This level of service." He glanced at Dr. Richardson and the flight attendant, "It makes a difference." The landing in Houston was perfect, smooth and ahead of schedule despite the weather delay. As the surgical team prepared to disembark, the flight attendant caught a glimpse of the waiting transplant team through the cabin windows. Another coordinated dance was about to begin, and their flight had been just one crucial step in a much longer journey. After the medical team departed, Dr. Richardson stayed behind for a moment. "Every person on these flights," she said, gathering her materials, from the pilots to the ground crew to the flight attendants, "they're all part of saving lives. Some people might not see it that way, but we know different, don't we?" The flight attendant nodded, understanding completely. As she began her post-flight checks, she reflected on how her role had evolved. She wasn't just serving passengers anymore, she was part of a sophisticated medical transport system where every action, every detail, could impact patient outcomes. The prejudices that had once clouded her judgment seemed not just wrong now, but impossibly distant from the professional she had become. 6 months into her role as a specialized medical transport flight attendant, a unique challenge forced the flight attendant to confront her growth in an unexpected way. The aviation company was expanding its medical transport division, and they needed someone to train new flight attendants specifically for medical flights. Dr. Richardson had recommended her for the position. Standing before a group of 20 new flight attendants in the training facility, she found herself sharing not just procedures and protocols, but the deeper lessons she'd learned. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, teaching others about prejudice and professionalism, when not so long ago, she'd been the one making snap judgments. "Medical transport isn't like typical private aviation," she explained to the attentive faces before her. "Every flight is part of someone's healing journey. Whether we're transporting doctors, patients, or vital medical equipment, we're not just providing a service, we're providing hope." During one training session, she received an urgent call. Dr. Richardson needed her for an immediate flight to Minneapolis. One of the new trainees, a flight attendant with years of commercial aviation experience, volunteered to observe. Dr. Richardson agreed. It would be an excellent learning opportunity. The patient was a 6-year-old boy named Ollie, accompanied by his parents and a pediatric nurse. Ollie had a rare neurological condition that required specialized treatment only available at a few hospitals in the country. The flight attendant could see the mixture of fear and hope in his parents' eyes, a look she'd grown familiar with over the past months. What made this flight particularly challenging was Ollie's severe anxiety about flying. The moment he boarded the aircraft, he began trembling, clutching his favorite dinosaur toy tightly. The trainee flight attendant watched as her instructor handled the situation. Instead of immediately trying to calm Ollie, she first focused on making his parents comfortable, knowing their anxiety would affect him. She then knelt down to Ollie's eye level, noticing his dinosaur. "That's a pretty cool Tyrannosaurus Rex you've got there," she said softly. "Did you know that we're going to be flying almost as high as the clouds where dinosaurs never got to go?" Ollie's eyes widened with interest, momentarily forgetting his fear. "Really?" he whispered. The flight attendant nodded, then shared a conspiratorial look with Dr. Richardson, who immediately understood and joined in. "You know what, Ollie?" Dr. Richardson added, pulling out her tablet. "I can show you exactly how high we'll be flying. Would you like to be my special co-pilot and help me track our altitude?" The boy's face lit up at the suggestion, and his parents exchanged grateful looks. Throughout the flight, the trainee observed how her instructor and Dr. Richardson worked in perfect synchronization to keep Ollie engaged and comfortable. They turned the potentially scary experience into an adventure, complete with special, dinosaur-approved snacks and a makeshift flight log where Ollie could record their height and speed. During a quiet moment, while Ollie was absorbed in watching clouds with his father, the trainee pulled her instructor aside. "I've been in aviation for 12 years, she whispered, "but I've never seen anything like this. How do you know exactly what each passenger needs?" The flight attendant smiled, remembering her own journey. "It's not about making assumptions or following a script," she explained. "It's about seeing each person's humanity first. Sometimes, the most important thing we can offer isn't in our service manual, it's in our ability to connect and understand." As they began their descent into Minneapolis, Ollie started getting anxious again. This time, the flight attendant had a special surprise ready. She'd prepared a small certificate naming him an honorary flight crew member, complete with a set of plastic wings she'd saved for special occasions. The joy on his face as she presented them made everyone in the cabin smile. Dr. Richardson, who had been monitoring Ollie's vital signs throughout the flight, caught her eye and nodded approvingly. "You've come so far," she said quietly while the parents were helping Ollie gather his things. "Remember that first day? Look at you now, not just overcoming your own prejudices but teaching others to do the same." The trainee, who had been taking notes throughout the flight, looked up. "What first day?" she asked curiously. The flight attendant took a deep breath and did something she hadn't done before. She shared the story of her first encounter with Dr. Richardson, including her initial mistake and the lessons she'd learned. "I could have lost my job that day," she admitted. "Instead, I gained a new perspective and purpose. Every passenger who steps onto this aircraft has a story, has fears, has hopes. Our job isn't just about serving drinks or maintaining safety protocols, it's about being part of their journey, whatever that journey might be." After landing, as they watched Ollie and his parents being greeted by the medical team, the trainee turned to her instructor. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said. "It's one thing to teach procedures and protocols, but understanding the human element, that's what makes the difference." Dr. Richardson joined them as they prepared for their return flight. "You know what the biggest challenge in medicine is?" she asked, including both flight attendants in the conversation. "It's not the complicated procedures or the long hours. It's remembering that behind every medical case is a human being with their own fears, hopes, and dignity. Today, you both showed that you understand that completely." The flight attendant looked at her trainee, seeing the same spark of understanding she'd developed over the past months. She realized that her journey had come full circle, from being someone who judged based on appearances to someone who could now help others see beyond their own prejudices. As they prepared the cabin for the return flight, she found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed. Each flight brought new challenges and opportunities to make a difference, no matter how small. The certificate she'd given Ollie might seem like a simple gesture, but she knew from experience that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could have the most lasting impact. 1 year after that fateful first encounter with Dr. Richardson, the flight attendant faced her biggest challenge yet. The aviation company was hosting a prestigious conference on medical transport aviation, and she had been asked to give a keynote speech about her experiences. The audience would include aviation executives, medical professionals, and flight crew members from around the world. The night before the conference, she sat in the quiet of her apartment, reviewing her notes. Her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Richardson. "Remember, your story isn't just about what happened that day, it's about what happened every day after." Those words helped calm her nerves as she prepared for what would be the most important presentation of her career. The conference hall was packed the next morning. As she took her place at the podium, she saw familiar faces in the audience, the trainee who had observed Ollie's flight, several medical teams they'd transported, and of course, Dr. Richardson, sitting in the front row with an encouraging smile. "A year ago," she began, her voice steadied despite her racing heart, "I almost ended my aviation career because of a single moment of prejudice. I was that flight attendant you've probably heard about, the one who tried to turn away the owner of her own private jet because she didn't fit my preconceived image of what success should look like." A murmur rippled through the audience. Some had heard the story, but never directly from the source. She continued, "But what could have been the end of my career became the beginning of something far more meaningful. Dr. Richardson didn't just forgive my mistake, she saw it as an opportunity to create change, not just in me, but in how we approach medical transport aviation." She shared stories from their flights, the emergency transport of the teenage basketball player, the heart surgeon's race against time, young Ollie's journey. With each story, she wove in the lessons learned about prejudice, professionalism, and the human element of medical transport. In commercial aviation, she explained, we often talk about luxury service. But in medical transport, we've redefined what luxury means. True luxury isn't about expensive champagne or designer uniforms, it's about creating an environment where patients feel safe, where medical professionals can work effectively, and where every member of the team understands their role in the healing process. As she spoke, she noticed several aviation executives leaning forward in their seats, taking notes. Her experience was highlighting a gap in traditional flight attendant training, the need to prepare crew members specifically for medical transport situations. The biggest lesson I've learned, she continued, is that every person who steps onto our aircraft is part of a larger story. Whether they're a world-renowned surgeon rushing to perform a transplant, a worried parent accompanying their child to treatment, or a patient fighting for their life, they all deserve to be seen, understood, and supported with dignity. Halfway through her speech, the conference hall doors opened quietly. To her amazement, she recognized some familiar faces entering: Ali's parents, the teenage basketball player from their emergency flight to Baltimore, and several other patients they'd transported over the past year. Dr. Richardson had arranged for them to attend. Seeing them there, healthy and smiling, brought tears to her eyes. She paused, gathering her composure, then said, "These are the real stories of medical transport aviation. Not just flight plans and medical equipment, but human beings whose lives were touched by the dedication of every person involved in their journey." She spoke about the training program she'd helped develop, emphasizing the importance of preparing flight attendants not just for the technical aspects of medical transport, but for the emotional and psychological challenges as well. "We're not just training people to serve beverages at altitude, we're training them to be part of a medical transport team that can mean the difference between life and death." The audience listened intently as she described the specific protocols they developed for different types of medical flights, from emergency patient transfers to organ transport missions. But more importantly, she emphasized the human element that made their program unique. "We teach our flight attendants to read the cabin," she explained. "Not just for safety issues, but for human needs. Is that parent too worried to eat? Does that surgeon need quiet time to review procedures? Is that child frightened of flying?" These aren't just comfort issues, they're vital parts of creating an environment that supports successful medical transport. As she neared the end of her speech, she turned to address Dr. Richardson directly. "You taught me that second chances aren't just about forgiveness, they're about transformation. You saw past my mistake to my potential, and in doing so, you didn't just change my career, you changed my entire perspective on what it means to serve others." The applause that followed was thunderous, but what meant more were the tears she saw in many eyes, the knowing nods from other flight attendants who understood the daily challenges and rewards of their profession. After her speech, countless people approached to share their own stories of prejudice, learning, and growth. One aviation executive pulled her aside, particularly moved by her presentation. "We've been focusing on the wrong things," he admitted. "All this time, we've been training our medical transport crews like luxury private jet staff. Your experience shows us there's a completely different approach needed." As the conference continued, she found herself surrounded by medical professionals and aviation experts eager to learn more about their program. But it was the quiet moment she shared with Ali's parents that meant the most. "You probably don't remember every flight," Ali's mother said, "but we remember every kindness, every small gesture that made our journey a little easier." That evening, at the conference reception, Dr. Richardson raised a toast. "A year ago," she announced to the gathered crowd, "I made a decision to turn a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for change." Today, we all witness the result of that decision. But more importantly, we witness the power of what happens when we choose to see the best in people, even in their worst moments. The success of the Medical Transport Conference sparked a wave of change across the private aviation industry. Within months, the flight attendant found herself at the center of a movement to revolutionize medical transport training. But amidst all the professional recognition, it was a routine flight that brought her journey full circle. The morning started like any other, with her performing the familiar pre-flight checks in the cabin. Dr. Richardson had informed her they would be training a new flight attendant today, someone who had specifically requested to learn from their team after hearing about their program at the conference. When the new trainee arrived, the flight attendant noticed something familiar in her demeanor, the same rigid attention to appearances and protocol that she herself had once possessed. The trainee's perfect uniform and meticulously styled hair reminded her so much of herself from that fateful day a year ago that she had to hide a knowing smile. Today's mission was to transport a renowned immunologist to a rural hospital dealing with a complex case. As they waited for the doctor to arrive, the trainee busied herself with arranging the cabin to 5-star hotel standards, clearly expecting someone who matched her preconception of a distinguished medical professional. The immunologist arrived wearing worn sneakers, faded jeans, and a simple sweater, carrying a backpack covered in children's stickers, gifts from her young patients. The flight attendant watched as a familiar scene began to unfold, catching the trainee's slight hesitation and flash of judgment. But before the trainee could say anything, the flight attendant stepped forward. "Dr. Chen," she greeted warmly, "welcome aboard. I've prepared the workstation with the case files you requested, and there's fresh coffee brewing, black with 2 sugars, just as you prefer." The trainee's expression shifted from doubt to surprise as she watched Dr. Chen graciously thank them and immediately immerse herself in her work, spreading papers across the table while speaking rapidly on the phone with her medical team. During the flight attendant took a moment to talk with the trainee in the galley. "You know," she said quietly, "exactly 1 year ago, I was standing where you are now, full of assumptions about what success and professionalism should look like. Would you like to hear a story?" As they worked together in the galley, she shared her journey, not just the mistake she'd made with Dr. Richardson, but all the lessons learned since then. The trainee listened intently, occasionally glancing at Dr. Chen, who was now conducting a virtual consultation with her team while simultaneously reviewing lab results. "The thing is," the flight attendant explained, "every person who steps onto this aircraft carries not just their belongings, but their hopes, fears, and responsibilities. Our job isn't to judge their appearance or make assumptions about their worth, it's to support their mission, whatever that might be." Dr. Richardson, who had been quietly observing the interaction, joined them in the galley. "You know what I love about this program you've helped create," she said to the flight attendant. "It's not just changing how we handle medical transport, it's changing how people think about service itself." The 3 women watched as Dr. Chen continued her work, coordinating with multiple medical teams to solve a complex case. The trainee's earlier judgment had been replaced by genuine admiration. "I can't believe I almost made the same mistake," she admitted. "When I requested this training, I thought I'd be learning about luxury service. But this is something entirely different, isn't it?" As they began their descent, Dr. Chen called them all together. "I heard you talking earlier," she said with a gentle smile. "About judging appearances. You know, in my field, we study how the body's immune system sometimes attacks itself because it fails to recognize its own cells as friendly. Prejudice is a lot like that, a failure to recognize our common humanity." The landing was smooth, and as they prepared for arrival, the flight attendant noticed something remarkable. The trainee had already adapted her approach, focusing on supporting Dr. Chen's work rather than maintaining superficial standards of luxury service. It was a small shift, but a significant one. After Dr. Chen departed, Dr. Richardson gathered the crew for a moment. "1 year ago," she said, "a single incident could have ended in anger and recrimination. Instead, it sparked a transformation that's now reaching far beyond our original goals. This program isn't just changing how we handle medical transport, it's changing how people think about human dignity and service." The trainee looked at her mentor with new understanding. "I requested this training because I heard about your prestigious medical transport program," she admitted. "But now I see that the real prestige isn't in the service standards or the protocols, it's in the way you honor each person's humanity." As they prepared the aircraft for its next mission, the flight attendant reflected on her journey. She thought about all the lives they'd touched over the past year, the teenage basketball player who had recently sent them a video of her first game back on the court, young Ollie who no longer feared flying, the countless medical professionals who had found support and understanding in their cabin. Dr. Richardson touched her arm gently. "You know what makes me proudest?" she said. "Not just that you learned from that first day, but that you've helped create a legacy. Every person you train, every life you touch, carries these lessons forward." The day ended as it had begun, with pre-flight checks and cabin preparations. But now these routine tasks carried deeper meaning. Each blanket folded, each medical equipment check, each interaction with crew and passengers was infused with the understanding that true service transcends appearances. As the sun set over the airfield, casting long shadows across the tarmac, the flight attendant watched her trainee preparing for the next day's flights. She saw in the young woman's actions the same transformation she had undergone, the shift from focusing on superficial standards to understanding the deeper meaning of their work. "Every flight is a new chance to make a difference," she told her trainee as they gathered their belongings. "Sometimes in big ways, like helping save a life, and sometimes in small ways, like making someone feel seen and respected. But every moment matters." Dr. Richardson, preparing to leave for her own next mission, offered one final thought. "You know what the best part of this whole journey has been?" she asked. "Watching how a moment that could have divided us instead created a ripple effect of understanding and compassion. That's the real miracle of second chances. They don't just change one person, they change everyone that person touches." The flight attendant looked around the cabin one last time before leaving. This space, which she had once seen simply as a luxury private jet, had become something far more meaningful, a place of healing, hope, and transformation. Her journey had come full circle, but in many ways, it was just beginning.